The GOAT, greatest player of all time. A debate which has been percolating around various NBA hot stoves for the better part of 60 years. But in the face of massive pace of play differential, defensive rules adjustments, and general league dynamic changes from one era to the next, it is fundamentally impossible to compare players from different eras. The better way, therefore, is to establish era-specific dominance by determining how great an individual player was against their peers, how forcefully they reigned over their generation of players. But when and where does an era begin and end? The cleanest and most precise way to break these eras up is by decade, and generally the individuals who owned each decade, beginning in the 1960s and running all the way until today, are the players most commonly found in these top 10 conversations and GOAT debates. But who are the GOATs of each decade, and how thoroughly did they dominate their specific eras? In order to determine the greatest players of all time, I am embarking on a 7-part series to break down each decade. Welcome in to episode 2, the 70s. And on the heels of the 1960s, where the NBA saw in the form of Wilt Chamberlain the most dominant individual specimen in league history, and its greatest winner in the form of Bill Russell, the 70s, though, were not so clear-cut, as this decade presented us with the most parity-ridden 10-year span in the sport's history. There were no repeat champions in this decade, while the LA Lakers and Boston Celtics were the only franchises to win more than one title in this 10-year span, and they both won just 2. In addition to the overall competitive balance in the NBA during this decade, the pace of play and rampant scoring outbursts from the 60s were substantially curtailed, with scoring drastically lowering from the 60s' unbelievable 115 point per night averages to just 108.3 per night in the 70s. But that wasn't the end of the changes that the league had in store for it in the decade of the 70s, as on August 5th, 1976, the ABA merged with the NBA, welcomed in the Indiana Pacers, New York Nets, Denver Nuggets, and San Antonio Spurs, thus ushering in the modern era of NBA basketball. And finally, 3 years later, prior to the 1979 league year, the NBA would introduce the three-point line on what was initially a 1-year provisional trial. Yeah, the 1970s was a bit of a transitional decade for the NBA. And despite there being no dynastic teams in this decade, and no team winning consecutive titles, oddly enough, this decade did feature 2 of the greatest handful of teams in NBA history, and they were presented to us in back-to-back seasons, and in the first 2 seasons of the decade at that. As in the 1970-71 league year, the Milwaukee Bucks, led by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Oscar Robertson, ran through the playoffs with a 12-2 record to capture the franchise's first NBA title. Kareem was Finals MVP and the league MVP that season, leading the Bucks to a 66-16 regular season mark, which at the time was the second highest win total in NBA history, behind only the 68-win 1966-67 Philadelphia 76ers. Not just that though, but the 1970 Bucks that season produced a per-game net differential of plus 12.26 points per game, which at the time was the highest win margin per game for an 82-game season in NBA history. And it still, to this day, is the second largest margin of victory per game for a single season. But it only lasted at the time as the highest total for that 1 year, as in the very next league year in 1971-72, arguably the greatest team in NBA history came along. And after a decade of heartbreak and failure, which included 7 finals losses during the 1960s, the LA Lakers finally got over the hump in resounding fashion as the 1971-72 Lakers won 33 consecutive games that year, which is still the all-time NBA record. They also set that aforementioned differential record at plus 12.28 points per game, breaking breaking the Bucks' record from the year before, and this mark still stands as the highest in league history. All of this on the way to their record-setting 69-win regular season, which stood as the highest in NBA history until the 95-96 Bulls' 72-win campaign, which came 25 years later. And in the playoffs, Jerry West would finally get over the hump alongside Finals MVP Will Chamberlain and Gail Goodrich. Despite these two teams' historical single-season dominance, neither were able to defend their titles, and the remaining decade would see a mixture of different teams and players winning. The NBA also saw some ABA stars come in and become dominant players in their own right during this decade. Rick Barry, who joined Golden State in the 1972-73 season, was one such player, becoming an immediate all-star for 6 consecutive years upon his re-entry into the NBA, while producing yet another great historical single-season run within this decade during 1974-75, as Barry scored 30.6 points per game that year, which was second best in the NBA, while leading the league in free throw percentage, steals per game, and finishing 6th in the league in assists per game that year. Barry was named first team All-NBA that season and Finals MVP, en route to leading the Warriors to the NBA championship, which would be their last until the 2015 season. Also joining the NBA in the 1976-77 season after a 5-year career with the ABA, Julius Erving. And while the high-flying doctor wouldn't win his first and only NBA championship until the 82-83 season, alongside Moses Malone on that legendary Philadelphia 76ers squad, in the 70s, Dr. J was a 2-time champ with the ABA as a member of the New York Nets, and he would make an immediate impact with his dunks and general playing style, which is largely credited as the precursor to this modern-day game. And along the way within the decade were some other great individual players, such as the 1974-75 NBA MVP Bob McAdoo, who also led the NBA in scoring 3 consecutive seasons from 73 through 75, with per-game averages over that 3-year span of 32 points and 14 rebounds per game. And while McAdoo would ultimately win 2 NBA championships, that wouldn't come until the 80s as a member of the dynastic Lakers. And this decade produced other noteworthy players, such as Walt Frazier, Elvin Hayes, and towards the end of that decade, Moses Malone, who would rise to more prominence in the following decade. And so, without any star players hoisting any significant amount of hardware in this decade, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar surfaced as the most individually dominant. For his part, he did capture 2 NBA championships in this 10-year span, one as a member of the Milwaukee Bucks to start the decade in 1970, and one as a member of the LA Lakers in the 1979 season to end it. During the 70s, Kareem averaged 28.2 points per game, which was the highest of any player for this decade, while scoring 21,814 total points, the 3rd most in NBA history for any decade aside from Will Chamberlain and Oscar Robertson, both in the supercharged pacing of the 1960s. And so, while Kareem was the most individually dominant player of this decade, he wasn't really able to parlay that dominance into winning until Magic Johnson came to town in the 1979 season, which would lead to Kareem winning 5 of his 6 career NBA championships, 4 of which would come in the decade of the 80s. But with no other players winning at a prolific rate in this decade, Kareem becomes the GOAT of the 70s based on his individual dominance. And while this does conclude our look at this decade of the 70s, make sure to subscribe and tune in.
Okay. Do it. Do it.
For the next episode of the GOAT by Decades, when we take a look at one of the most compelling 10-year spans in NBA history, which has arguably the largest collection of all-time NBA greats, the 80s. Until next time.